Hi, this is NextGen Picks. I was at a friend's house Tuesday. They just bought a $2,000 OLED. We sat down, he hit the power button on the remote, and we sat there in silence for 11 literal seconds while the home screen struggled to load past a massive, unskippable minivan ad. 11 seconds for a flagship? That shouldn't happen, but it does because the TV industry is hiding a specific hardware loophole. What if I told you that you could buy the exact same flawless panel from Sony or Samsung, but permanently strip out the lag, the background tracking software, and the home screen ads? You can, but you won't find it in normal retail stores. Before I show you exactly how to bypass the consumer market entirely, hit subscribe NextGen Picks if you're tired of sponsored tech channels hiding the actual flaws in expensive gear. We buy our own testing units here to keep it honest. Now, here's where it gets weird. The hardware sitting in your living room right now is actively working against you. If you walk into a Best Buy this weekend and stare at a $2,000 display, the glass itself is genuinely incredible. The actual light-emitting diodes are marvels of optical engineering, but the computer running that glass, it is basically a disposable smartphone processor from 5 years ago. Most premium consumer televisions ship with barely 8 GB of internal eMMC flash storage. Half of that is instantly eaten by the operating system. Then the manufacturer forces down background updates, automatic content recognition software that takes screenshots of what you watch, and oversized promotional banners for streaming services you don't even subscribe to NextGen Picks. It feels cheap because it is. Manufacturers know you will simply accept the stuttering menus, the delayed volume inputs, and the home screen freezing because the alternative is trying to cram an 85-inch piece of highly fragile glass back into your mid-size sedan to return it. They subsidize the physical cost of that beautiful panel by selling your viewing habits to data brokers. That means the TV's processor is constantly working in the background, choking on its own tracking software. Actually, let me explain that better. Think about what happens when you plug a PS5 or an Apple TV 4K into a standard smart television. You are trying to bypass 90% of what makes the TV smart, but the internal processor is still running. It's still pinging servers. Over a 2-year ownership timeline, that cheap flash memory degrades from constant read-write cycles. The TV doesn't completely break, it just asphyxiates. Navigating from HDMI 1 to HDMI 2 starts to feel like operating a dial-up modem. Day 1, it's great. Month 14 is where the cracks show. That is money you can't get back. Zoom out for a second and look at the commercial market. Offices, digital signage, retail stores, sports bars, they do not tolerate lag. If a menu stutters at a corporate boardroom during a pitch, the IT guy gets fired. That brings me to the Sony Bravia BZ40L series, specifically the 65-in and 85-in models. This is the hardware loophole. Sony takes the exact same premium XR Mini-LED panels they use in their high-end consumer televisions, pulls them off the assembly line, and installs them into heavy-duty commercial chassis. What do they take out? Everything that ruins the consumer experience. There is no Google TV home screen ad banner. There is no microphone listening for wake words. There is zero bloatware. When I had the 65-in BZ40L on my test bench for 2 weeks, the thing that actually got to me was the sheer silence of the interface. You press power on the remote, the screen is instantly on. You press the input button, it switches in under half a second. It just works. That sounds painfully obvious, but when you compare it to a standard consumer Samsung S90C that takes 3 full seconds just to register a volume click while it desperately tries to load a sponsored ad. For a reality show, the commercial display feels like alien technology. I tested this side by side with a standard consumer Bravia. Within the first 10 minutes, I realized I could never go back. The BZ40L features a specialized deep matte anti-glare coating designed to diffuse direct overhead lighting. It handles a 10% HDR brightness window, hitting roughly 1/200 nits without breaking a sweat, and it retains the full 48 GB per second HDMI 2.1 bandwidth for 4K 120Hz gaming. I almost didn't include this part, but it actually matters more than I expected. The build quality is noticeably heavier. Commercial displays are designed for 24/7 continuous operation. When I ran a thermal imaging camera over the back of the chassis after a 3-hour HDR gaming load, the heat distribution was entirely different from the consumer equivalent. The internal heat sinks are physically larger. The capacitors in the power supply are rated for higher thermal loads because these units are meant to run flight arrival times at an airport for 5 years straight without melting. There is a specific feature hidden inside this unit that completely changes how you manage a home theater setup. It's called Pro Mode. You have to enter a specific hidden button combination on the remote just to unlock it. Once you do, you gain access to a root-level control system. You can force the display to power onto a specific HDMI input the second it detects a video signal. If you wake up your Apple TV, the display snaps to life instantly. No loading screens, no Smart Hub overlays asking you to sign into an account. That spec sheet reads like a dating profile. Impressive until you meet it in person. But in this case, the reality matches the math. You get reference-level color calibration by default. In a retail store, consumer TVs run in vivid mode, artificially crushing the EOTF tracking to make colors look unnaturally punchy under industrial fluorescent lighting. When you get it home, you turn that off and suddenly you notice the backlight blooming around subtitles. Commercial displays don't play that game. If a major brand puts a digital asset on a Sony commercial display, their specific hex code red has to be completely accurate. You inherit that strict accuracy. You aren't fighting aggressive software trying to oversaturate the image. Now, I will admit a limitation of my own testing here. Finding exact retail pricing for these is genuinely annoying. Because they are B2B products, prices fluctuate heavily based on wholesale distributors. You can't just walk into a big box store and put one in a cart. You have to buy them individually online through commercial AV suppliers. You will usually pay around $1,600 for a 65-in BZ40L. Now, you're probably thinking, wait, didn't you just say I should buy an expensive business monitor instead of a dedicated consumer OLED? Yes, I'm fully aware that sounds insane, but here is my take. And I know half of you will disagree with me on this. For 80% of American living rooms, a bright matte finish commercial mini-LED with 0 smart features is a vastly superior purchase to a glossy consumer OLED that turns into a dark mirror during the day and lags out after 3 years. The OLED will give you perfect inky blacks if you watch movies in a pitch-black basement. But if you have windows or lamps, or you just want a device that turns on when you ask it to, the commercial panel wins. Am I wrong? Drop your current setup in the comments. I'm genuinely curious what you're running, and more importantly, how many seconds it takes for your home screen to load Netflix right now. Go test it. I'll wait. I know. That sounds like I'm contradicting the entire tech reviewer industry that worships perfect black levels above all else. Hear me out. If you're already reaching for your phone to check B&H Photo for commercial Sony pricing, hold on, because Sony isn't the only manufacturer quietly doing this. And if you think $1,600 is too much to spend just to escape forced advertisements and clunky menus, we need to look at what happens when you apply this exact same white label commercial strategy to the mid-tier market. The price completely fractures. Fast forward 6 months into my testing cycle, and I found a completely different brand quietly releasing commercial-grade panels for under $1,000. Which products do you want to see put through this exact same teardown next? Let me know. But first, let's look at the budget alternative. But that's not even the part I wanted to talk about. The real chaos happens when you step away from commercial hardware and look at the $1,000 mid-tier consumer market. Brands like TCL and Hisense are locked in a brutal street fight for dominance. They cram absurd hardware into their 2026 models, hoping you won't notice the structural shortcuts. Let's look at the 65-in TCL QM852G. On paper, it completely destroys the Sony commercial display we just talked about. 5,000 local dimming zones, a peak brightness hitting 3,500 nits in a 10% window. For roughly $1,150, it sounds like absolute theft. It is bright. Wait, let me back up. Bright is an understatement. When I put the TCL next to an older LG display in my studio, the QM852G physically hurt my eyes during a desert scene in Dune. But pushing 3,000 nits through 5,000 distinct zones requires massive voltage, and that voltage creates a terrifying thermal reality. After running this through a 4K gaming stress test, the actual numbers showed a massive problem. The plastic rear chassis right above the main board measured 180 turbo Fahrenheit on my thermal camera. The television was literally baking its own internal components. Over a 2-year timeline, those sustained temperatures dry out the capacitors on the power supply board, leading directly to the dreaded black screen of death right after your warranty conveniently expires. It just dies. Manufacturers cut costs on the cooling fins, and you pay the price 30 months later. There is another specific physical flaw with the TCL QM815G that nobody mentions in their unboxing videos: structural coil whine. When the television is pushing a massive HDR highlight, say a blinding sun in a sci-fi movie, the power supply is drawing nearly 400 watts from the wall. If you mute the audio, you can physically hear a high-pitched 42 decibel buzzing coming from the back panel. It sounds like a dying fluorescent tube. During loud action scenes, you won't notice it, but during a quiet, tense dialogue scene in a brightly lit room, it drives you absolutely insane. You can't unhear it. This happens because TCL uses lower tolerance inductors on their power boards to save about $3 in manufacturing costs per unit. $3. That is the price of your sanity. And this is the part that genuinely frustrates me. Hisense plays the exact same game with their 2026 U8P model. They give you a brilliant panel for $950. The marketing team earned their bonus on that name, calling it Mini-LED Pro. I'll give them that. But to hit that sub-$1,000 price tag, they use a bargain bin MediaTek processing chip. If you feed the U8P a flawless 4K Blu-ray signal, it looks spectacular. Give it a heavily compressed 1080p cable broadcast of a Sunday football game, the motion interpolation logic completely falls apart. You get terrible digital ghosting around the football every time the quarterback throws a pass. It looks like the ball has a translucent force field around it. I know what you're thinking right now. NextGen picks, I only stream 4K Netflix anyway, so who cares if the 1080p upscaling is bad? That is exactly the trap. Let's talk about the silent killer, mandatory firmware updates. This is a massive issue on the Hisense U8P. Last October, Hisense pushed a software patch meant to fix a minor Bluetooth audio bug. Instead, it completely broke the EARC HDMI handshake for thousands of users. I had this exact unit on my test bench when the update hit. One morning, my connected Samsung soundbar just stopped receiving audio. The TV simply refused to recognize it. I spent 2 hours digging through forum threads only to find out the temporary fix was to unplug the TV from the wall, wait 30 seconds, and restart it every single time you wanted to watch a movie. This is the reality of buying mid-tier consumer electronics. You are an unpaid beta tester for their software engineers. When you buy a commercial display like the Sony, the firmware is locked down. It is validated for months before release because a broken audio handshake in a corporate conference room results in thousands of returned units. In your living room, they just expect you to wait 3 weeks for another patch. Remember what I said earlier about those 11 literal seconds of boot-up lag on that flagship? The Hisense and TCL consumer models degrade even faster. Their internal flash storage is bottom-tier eMMC. By month 8, navigating Google TV on the U8P feels like walking through wet cement. You press down on the directional pad, wait a full second, and then the cursor moves. You are forced to buy an external streaming box just to change inputs without wanting to throw the remote through your drywall. Everything I just said, it almost doesn't matter because the vocal enthusiast community completely ignores these mini-LED models anyway. They immediately point you to the LG C6 OLED. The C6 costs around $1,700 for the 65-in version. It features perfect pixel-level contrast because each pixel generates its own light. It handles motion beautifully without the weird digital ghosting of the Hisense. Every major publication gives it 5 stars. Let's bring this back to your actual living room. The C6 has a massive hidden trade-off called Auto Brightness Limiting, or ABL. To protect the organic pixels from permanent burn-in, the TV aggressively dims the entire screen if a bright static image stays up for too long. If you watch a hockey game, the massive amount of white ice tricks the thermal sensors. By the second period, the TV drops the full-screen sustained brightness down to a pathetic 150 nits. You're squinting. You bought a premium display, and now you're watching a dark gray screen in the middle of Sunday afternoon because the TV is terrified of destroying itself. This is what they don't show you in the brightly lit retail stores. Day 1, you're blown away by the infinite contrast in a dark room. Month 6, you're closing your blinds at 2 p.m. just to see who has the puck. If you've owned an OLED for more than a year, tell me if this matches your experience down in the comments. I constantly hear buyers completely shocked by how aggressive the ABL gets during winter sports or bright video games. If you're screaming at the screen right now saying that OLED is the only acceptable way to watch movies, I hear you. But here's the brand criticism that always splits opinion. I know half of you will disagree with me on this. I would rather buy a $1,000 TCL Mini-LED with severe off-angle color washout and a terrible UI, instantly disconnected from the internet, plug in an Apple TV and deal with the heat output, then pay nearly double for an LG OLED that forcefully dims my daytime viewing to survive. The consumer OLED market has convinced people to pay a premium to babysit their own hardware. I refuse to do it. Now, if you are sitting in a perfectly light-controlled basement theater, the math changes completely. But for a central family room with bay windows, the fragile OLED is a mistake. I spent way too long testing the thermal curves on these 3 units. My family has concerns about my sanity, but the data doesn't lie. The TCL gives you brute force that burns out. The Hisense gives you a great panel ruined by cheap processing. The LG gives you perfection that cowers in the sunlight. We need to classify exactly who should buy which of these specific panels, because making the wrong choice here means staring at a compromised image for the next 5 years. Everything you just heard, it only matters if you actually align your purchase with the room you're putting it in. Treating a display purchase like a pure math problem on a spec sheet is exactly how you end up miserable. I'll give them credit for this one thing though. The LG C6 OLED genuinely belongs in one highly specific environment. If you have blackout curtains, a dedicated surround sound setup, and you strictly watch 4K Blu-rays in the dark after the kids go to bed, the LG is your panel. The perfect blacks are physically impossible to replicate on standard LED technology. The motion algorithm for 24-frame cinema is incredibly clean, but you have to accept the thermal babysitting. If you install that fragile glass in a bright open concept house with massive bay windows, it is a catastrophic mistake. You're going to spend $1,700 to stare at a dark, glossy reflection of your own couch. For the sun-drenched living room, the Hisense U8P is the logical play. The sheer brute force of 2,500 nits cuts through afternoon glare like a laser. You just have to treat it like a dumb monitor the second you pull it out of the cardboard. Do not connect it to your Wi-Fi. Seriously, buy an external streaming box like an Apple TV 4K, plug it directly into HDMI 1, and physically tape over the TV's Ethernet port if you have to. If you let that internal processor touch the internet, it immediately starts downloading the bloatware that will choke the main board to death over the next 30 months. Remember what I said earlier about my friend waiting 11 literal seconds for his flagship OLED home screen to load? You bypass that entirely by keeping your hardware strictly offline. When I unboxed the 65-in U8P last month, I ran an entire 40-hour burn-in cycle without ever letting it ping my network. The menus stayed lightning fast. The volume slider appeared instantly on screen the microsecond I hit the button. The moment I connected it to a test router to check the firmware, a 3GB update forced its way in, replacing the home screen background with a massive banner ad for a car insurance company. The input lag navigating the settings menu jumped from 4 milliseconds to nearly 12. It was a completely different, noticeably worse machine within 10 minutes. You might be sitting there thinking, NextGen picks, Why are you making a television purchase sound like a hostage negotiation? I know. It sounds ridiculous that we have to actively defend our own hardware from the companies that manufactured it, but that leads us directly to the final verdicts. I segment these by who they actually serve, because a single best TV label is a complete fiction. The best value of 2026 is the Hisense U8P, provided you follow the strict offline rule I just laid out. It gives you flagship level peak brightness for right around $950. That leaves you enough cash left over to buy a dedicated Apple TV and a decent entry-level soundbar for the exact same price as a bare-bones Sony consumer display. You win on sheer hardware economics. The best overall, however, goes to the Sony Bravia BZ40L commercial display. It is the only panel currently available that respects your time, your data privacy, and your eyes. It gives you the legendary Sony motion processing, the ultra-durable commercial power supply, and an instant-on interface that treats you like a professional, not a target demographic. Yes, finding a commercial AV supplier to buy one is annoying. Yes, spending $1,600 on a display with 0 built-in streaming apps feels counterintuitive, but it will outlast any consumer model on the shelf by years, which brings up a massive argument. Is it better to buy a $950 mid-tier display and replace it in 4 years when the backlight inevitably burns out, or spend $2,500 on a premium consumer flagship and pray the mainboard survives for 7? I stand firmly on the side of the cheaper panel paired with an external streamer. Hardware depreciates far too fast to invest in high-end consumer smart TVs anymore. The silicon inside them is obsolete before it even leaves the shipping container. I want you to vote in the comments right now. Are you team buy cheap and replace, or team buy once, cry once? I want to see the ratio of people who churn budget screens versus the premium holdouts. The math favors the cheap replacement cycle. I hate it, but when a $2,000 consumer mainboard dies on month 37, leaving you with a massive glass paperweight that costs $600 just to diagnose at a repair shop, the budget replacement strategy suddenly looks like pure financial genius. Here is the reality no one wants to admit. The modern smart television is not a product, it is a Trojan horse. The manufacturers are selling you beautiful, heavy, fragile hardware at a razor-thin margin because they plan to make their actual profit by monitoring everything you watch. They use automatic content recognition software to take digital snapshots of your screen multiple times a second, and they sell that telemetry to data brokers for the entire lifespan of the device. They treat your private living room like a billboard you paid for. Every single time your screen stutters while you're just trying to switch over to your PlayStation, it's because the internal processor is prioritizing a background ad download over your remote control input. You are literally paying a premium to be advertised to on hardware that actively degrades its own performance to serve those ads. The manual is thicker than a phone book, but explains absolutely nothing about how to disable the ACR tracking. Stop buying into it, reject the cycle, treat the glass as just glass, move the computing power to a dedicated box you actually control, and refuse to let a display brand dictate how your living room operates. If you want to check current pricing on the commercial Sony panels or find the specific hardware revisions of the Hisense and TCL models that avoid the bad firmware updates, I keep a continuously updated list of vetted sources in the description below. I only link to models that avoid the revision traps we talked about today. Using those links is the safe path, and it helps fund the channel so we can keep buying these units ourselves instead of relying on brand-sponsored review units. Hi, it's me again. This decision shapes how you approach every single screen you buy from now on. You are in control of the hardware, not the other way around. Don't let them sell you a compromised, slow computer when all you actually needed was a really good light bulb. Hit the like button if this helped clarify the mess. Check your firmware settings tonight, and I'll see you in the next one.